Da starter vi med Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's seminar here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I'm very happy to see that so many of you found the way here to NUPI on this cold and wet November morning, and also a heartily welcome to our online audience. As some of you might have guessed, I'm not Tora Bergen-Naterstad. My name is Helge Blakkesrud. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oslo and a senior researcher here at NUPI. And I have the pleasure to chair this morning's seminar on how nationalist rhetoric prepared the ground for the invasion of Ukraine, or what Sergei has called Russia's new war nationalism. The speaker here today is Sergei Fedyonin, who is a postdoctoral researcher at EHESS in Paris. Sergei is a rising star in the field of Russian nationalism studies. He has published on the topic in Russian, in French, and in English. And his next publication, I assume, is the chapter on Russian nationalism in the revised Routledge Handbook on Russian politics and society that will appear on Routledge early next year. In this seminar, he asks, what can studying the regime's emergent war nationalism tell us about the identity dimension of the current conflict in Ukraine? And Sergei will speak for some 35-40 minutes, and then we should have ample time for questions and interventions from the audience. But without any further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Sergei Fedyonin. Please.
Thank you, Helge. Thank you, Helge, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the NUPI and more personally Helge and Tora for having me today. It's a big pleasure to be here to present in this audience. What I'm going to present is a work in progress that the three of us, Helge, Tora, and myself, are currently developing. So it's an article that we are currently working on. And in this presentation, I will talk about what I call war nationalism, or Russia's new war nationalism, using the example of Russian official rhetoric. My talk will be divided into three uneven parts. First, I will reflect on the concept of war nationalism. Here I will show that it can be a relevant category of analysis in the study of modern warfare in general and Russia's war against Ukraine in particular. Then, in the second and largest part, I will present some preliminary findings of our empirical analysis of Russian official discourse. Here I will focus on the use of nationalist rhetoric by the regime, the Putin regime, as the expression of Russia's new war nationalism. And I will argue, this is my main argument today, that the instrumentalization of the nationalist rhetoric helped prepare the ground for the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. To conclude, I will very briefly discuss other potential ways to study war nationalist dynamics in Russia. Here we go. So let's start with some theoretical considerations. Why war nationalism? In 2014, for the centenary of World War I, the historian Eric Lohr published an essay titled War Nationalism as part of an edited volume under the common title The Empire and Nationalism at War. Lohr uses the term war nationalism by analogy with that of war communism in the former Russian Empire from 1918 to 1921, And war communism, as you probably know, became a widely used term to denote the way in which the context of the Russian Civil War had shaped the early Bolshevik state and its economic policies. But as Lore argues, quote, a comparable term is needed to think about nationalism in the Russian Empire during World War I, war nationalism, end quote. So he describes the dramatic transformation of Russian pre-war and notably anti-German nationalism into wartime nationalism. And he refers to, in particular, to mass violence against German subjects, mass confiscations of German-owned property, the nationalization of prisoners of war policies, and so on. So my argument here is that war nationalism, this concept, can be used beyond the context of 20th century world wars. And in my view, it may be suited for both case study analysis and comparative research, since it brings together two theoretical perspectives. First, it highlights the importance of thinking about nationalism as an event whose social and political salience increases during wartime, in wartime. And second, war constitutes in itself a mobilizational context, including in terms of rising national awareness. Therefore, war nationalism is radically different from nationalism in the so-called settled times, because here we have nationalism that takes on violent and militarized forms in face of an external threat. Based on these considerations, one can apply the term of war nationalism to the analysis of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I see two main reasons for that. First, the appeal of nationalism is central to both sides in wartime. Indeed, we have two different kinds of nationalism. Ukraine fights for its survival as a nation and a sovereign state. So, in some way, it is an existential nationalism. Because if Ukraine stops fighting, it will probably cease to exist as such. In the case of Russia, the Putin regime's aggression appeals to some revengeful, vindictive nationalism. It combines the claim about the national unity of Ukrainians and the Russians with a sense of imperial, Tsarist and Soviet nostalgia. The Russian dominant imperative is less obvious than that of Ukraine, but it has to do with redefining the borders of Russianness. I would argue that both imperialist and ethnic strands of Russian nationalism are in play here. For instance, some Russian actors emphasize state power and territorial expansion on Ukraine, like the Izborsky Club members and others, while others focus primarily on defending Russians and ethnic Russians or Russian-speaking Ukrainians as an ethnic and cultural community. In this respect, the war in Ukraine is different from the wars, Russia's wars in Chechnya, in Syria, or in Georgia, where state power and security arguments largely prevailed over the ethnic and national ones. It is then clear that ideas matter. On the other hand, the war nationalist prism helps focus on the context and dynamics rather than their ideas. Anyway, in my view, these two approaches are complementary, not contradictory. And the second reason I see is that the Russo-Ukrainian war that de facto began in 2014 seems to have acted as a nationalizing force, not only for Ukraine, which is quite obvious, but also for Russia. It's had a significant impact on nation building and identity politics in both countries. Of course, Russia's war on Ukraine is a multidimensional conflict, and as such it can be framed differently, and here I distinguish between three central logics in framing this war. The first logic is mostly endorsed by realist international relations scholars. It is in line with the balance of power logic and deals with the security-related causes of this war. The main cause would be NATO's enlargement and Moscow's perception of Ukraine joining NATO as an existential threat for Russian security. And this frame is notably corroborated by the statements of Russian state officials since at least Putin's 2007 Munich speech and Russia's demand for reaching a security deal with NATO countries. Here one can think of the Minsk agreements and two draft security treaties released last December and also known as Putin's ultimatum. The second frame is advanced by liberal-minded scholars, and their argument is that the emergence of a Western style democracy in neighboring Ukraine would be a threat to the Russian regime in terms of political change, because the Russian regime, as you know, is largely considered kleptocratic and authoritarian. In a nutshell, as Persson and McFall state, Ukrainian democracy would undermine the Kremlin's own stability and proposed rationale for autocratic state leadership in Russia. But I think we need to dampen this approach, to use Colton's term in his recently published article, quote, Ukraine prior to the war has been a work in progress. Russia was a work in regress. Nonetheless, on the eve of that invasion, the Ukrainian regime was not a model democracy, since it had many governance problems, including the lack of the rule of law and corruption. And finally, there is a third logic, a nationalist one, and I want to emphasize this third logic. In other terms, the war in Ukraine can be seen as also an identity threat to Russia, and more broadly as an identity project for the Russian regime. It seems, however, that scholars tend to underapply this identity-related dynamics of the Russo-Ukrainian war. You know that historically Russia and Ukraine have been two intertangled societies. For their relationship was quite asymmetrical. Therefore, as Igor Torbakov argues, after Ukraine achieved independence in 1991, its ultimate goal, quote, was to assert its distant national identity and sovereignty, which means, in practical terms, to attain recognition of its separateness from Russia, end quote. And these dynamics resulted in several processes in Ukraine, meaning the creation of a new non-Soviet or Russia-centered historical narrative, reinforced by decommunization policy in Ukraine, and some other processes include downgrading the Russian language, challenging the dominance of Russian in Ukraine, and creating a united Orthodox Church which now escapes Moscow's control. All this contributed to further Ukraine's emancipation from Russian dominance. In a nutshell, I would say that nation building in Ukraine compels the remaking of the Russian nation. But here again, the dynamic aspect is crucial. Otherwise, how to explain that Ukraine and its identity were not seen as a threat by the Yeltsin administration in the 90s and the Putin regime in the 2000s, even if some Russian actors called and keep calling for the annexation of Crimea to Russia in the 90s and 2000s. Why did the Kremlin not respond to calls from nationalists to invade Ukraine before, for instance, before 2014, before the crisis in and over Ukraine, and in 2013, when the Donbas conflict started? This suggests that the perception of Ukraine as an identity threat to Russia has been gradually constructed in Russian official discourse. Looking at this will help us to better understand the grounds for the ongoing Russian invasion on Ukraine, and this brings me to my second part. Our main objective with Dora and Helge was to analyze the discourse of the Russian regime. In a way, we can capture this nationalist logic I have briefly described. The first question we had to address is the discourse of whom we want to study. Here we decided to focus on political institutions rather than individual actors. That's why instead of identifying a few individuals, we analyzed text and documents scrapped from the websites of 3 key state institutions, meaning the Kremlin, the Russian presidency, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the State Duma. Second, we needed to capture the dynamic aspect, and to do so, we have chosen to look at a large period of time, years rather than months or weeks. The period we defined goes from 2004 to 2022. Why 2004 is a start point? For 2 reasons. First, this is 10 years before the start of the undeclared war, Russia's war on Ukraine. And second, it's also the year of the first Maidan revolution that brought President Yushchenko to power in Ukraine. As for our endpoint, February 2022 seems like an obvious choice, since we are willing to know how nationalist rhetoric prepared the ground for the invasion. However, we have decided to extend the analysis until last September in order to see if the identified trends persisted during the first months of the full-scale war. Thus, we have 3 corpora that will partly be that will be partly updated and further explored in the next few weeks. So we have this Kremlin corpora that contains many documents, notably public statements of the President of Russia and his participation in some public meetings, and all these documents have been published on the Kremlin website. Then we have the corpus of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which contains public statements of Foreign Minister Lavrov, his deputies, and official MID statements. And finally, the Duma corpus that contains transcripts of parliamentary sessions. So we have not yet had time to explore the Duma corpus in detail, so I will focus primarily on the first 2. What did we search for in these 3 corpora? We wanted to look at how selected nationalist tropes are used in Russian official discourse. These tropes include Russophobia, de-Russification, and national traitors. You will ask why these 3. The answer is because these tropes were typical of nationalist rhetoric long before they have been integrated into Russian official discourse. In other words, we are sure that no nationalist actors have used these terms as categories of social practice before. Russophobia is, of course, the central trope, since the hatred of the Russophobic West was a commonplace of nationalist rhetoric since among left-wing, so-called left-wing patriots, or Red-Brown Alliance, as Russian liberals call them, in the 90s, and even since the post-Soviet era in the so-called Russian, informal Russian party in the Soviet Union. Some of you may have heard of Soviet mathematician and dissident Shafarevich and his book called Russophobia. This essay was first completed in 1982 and circulated as samizdat in the Soviet Union, and then it was even translated into French. Here you have the book cover of this translation, and Shafarevich described the role of the Russian intelligentsia. He called it a small nation during the Bolshevik Revolution. So he argued that that group was dominated by Jews in the former Russian Empire, and that group hated the so-called traditional Russian way of life. So you see that this trope is quite typical of Russian nationalist discourse. Likewise, the term derussification was widely used by Russian nationalists and patriotic forces in the 90s to decry notably the population decline in Russia, and then since the 2000s, non-Slavic immigration into Russia too. Finally, the stigma against national traitors was often used against the Russian regimes deemed not national enough for nationalists, for the nationalists. That is, the regime was perceived as unfavorable to the ethnic majority in Russia, different rulers, Soviet and then Russia, were depicted as national traitors, including Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and even Putin in radical nationalist discourse. So we have sought to code all occurrences of these three tropes in our corpora, looking first at their meaning and second at the referent of the messages. Now let's take a look at the findings. I will mostly discuss the Russophobia trope because we have quantifiable results in that case. First of all, there is a huge increase in the use of the term in all three corpora between two periods before and after 2014. However, the proportion is not the same because there is a 2021 fold increase for the Kremlin corpus and the 40-fold increase for the mid corpus, while only a small one, a 3-fold increase for the Duma. Why is that? I would argue that the lesser growth rate in the Duma corpus indicates that radical discourse on Russophobia pre-existed in the public discourse, as notably represented by the Communist Party, Zyuganov's Communist Party, and Zhirinovsky, the late Zhirinovsky LDPR. And for years it was not incorporated into more official rhetoric. So the Duma could partly be a source of the incorporation we are talking about, especially since the term was mobilized not only by the systemic parliamentary opposition, but also by United Russia members of parliament, like Alexei Pushkov, who was known even in the 2000s as a fierce critic of the West. The other potential source is a number of parastate nationalist actors who are conservative and national imperialists ideologically, and who gather around the radical organizations like Tsargrad TV channel and the Izborsky Club. Regarding the meaning of Russophobia, we could identify several categories. First, and here you can see the first column, that are the messages that where we have the uses of this term understood as anti-ethnic Russians or anti-Russian compatriots to the Russian living abroad sentiments. So on several occasions, Putin compared Russophobia to anti-Semitism, both being depicted as expressions of aggressive / radical / caveman Pещерный nationalism and neo-Nazism. Interestingly, Putin uses the same qualifiers to describe, in a negative way of course, domestic nationalist actors as well as foreign, especially Ukrainian actors. The vocabulary is the same. Another interesting point here is that the share of messages framing Russophobia as anti-Ruski sentiments is much higher in the Kremlin corpus than in the mid one. So the proportion is 42% and only 6% in the mid corpus. At the same time, this is not so surprising since the mid is much more concerned about the representations of Russia as a state. And here we have this second category, which is the predominant category in both corpora, and the share of those messages is the highest in the mid corpus, with something like 87% of all the messages that refer to Russia as a state, and then the Russophobia as an anti-Russia as a state sentiments. So two corpora are intermingled in this regard, but the mid gives us a whole range of interpretations of Russophobia trope. Here Russia is what is called Russophobia is the image of Russia as an equal partner for the West, the so-called Western double standards. Then Russia is a security threat for Ukraine and the West, especially in the context of Russia's alleged interference in the US elections. Then sanctions on Russia as an attempt to isolate it. And what is interesting, it's not since the Euromaidan, but since the Magnitsky Act of 2012. And finally, criticism of the human rights situation in Russia, which is now framed since 2014, is framed as Russophobia too. Then we have the understanding of Russophobia as anti-Russian and anti-Soviet historical narrative. Here we are in the middle of memory wars related to World War II that date back to the 2000s, but have intensified during the 2010s. And the Russian mid qualifies as Russophobic the so-called rewriting of history. For example, in the case of Ukraine, it's the image of Holodomor in the 1930s Ukraine as a genocide against the Ukrainian people. Then the so-called rehabilitation of collaborators with Nazi Germany, and the removal of Soviet mostly military monuments in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. Finally, there is a theme of equal so-called equal responsibility placed on Nazi Germany and the USSR, which is rejected by Russian officials as an expression of Russophobia. What is a bit surprising is that Russophobia is seldom associated with anti-Russian language policies abroad compared to the prevalence of anti-Russia as a state framing. I think, however, that the share of this category will be higher in the Duma corpus. Once again, I'm sorry for not being able to present you the whole picture today. Then we have one not so surprising but important finding, is that Russophobia is about everything but Putin. That means that the regime's discourse forecloses nationalist criticism, and Putin cannot be treated publicly as Russophobic, and this will be surely confirmed by the analysis of the Duma corpus. Let's now address the referent part of this analysis. Who is then Russophobic in Russia official discourse? First of all, here we can observe how Ukraine was gradually constructed as an identity threat to Russia and its identity. Under the presidency of Yushchenko, there was only isolated accusations of Ukraine as conducting Russophobic policies. However, these accusations become ubiquitous from 2014 on. Russophobia is attributed to the Ukrainian elites, who in turn would project it onto the Ukrainian society. This is the general frame. At the same time, Ukraine is often depicted as a proxy and its leadership as clients. The referent is still in Ukraine, but some agency is sometimes assigned to external forces. Moreover, Ukraine's Russophobia is more explicitly perceived as a Western foreign policy instrument against Russia. At the same time, we have this messages regarding Baltic states and Eastern European countries, most of time Poland. And so we can see that since 2014, the Russian regime breaks free from certain taboos regarding these countries in the context of memory wars with Russia, because before 2014 they were not considered as Russophobic officially, as you can see. As for Georgia, only Saakashvili government and its legacy are considered Russophobic. Then what is interesting is that in the case of Europe, the European institutions, the European Union and the European Council, these institutions are mainly presented as captured by an aggressive Russophobic minority, meaning Eastern European EU member states and some politicians, including High Representative Josep Borrell. These countries are only rarely seldom named, but we can guess that that's about Poland and Baltic countries, and they are framed as a Russophobic minority or even a lobby within the EU and NATO. The United States, as you can see, is the most cited referent, at least in the mid corpus, and US Russophobia is presented as a result of domestic struggles between the Republicans and the Democrats, beginning in the time of the Obama administration. Russophobia is also depicted as imposed on the American society by the political establishment, called Russophobic politikane. It's a Russian pejorative term for politicians. Another trope is the struggle between a rational, so-called rational Trump administration and Russophobic democratic-controlled Congress. As for the UK, the main theme here is the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury, which is described as an anti-Russian plot, and the emphasis is also put since 2014 on the historical roots of the British anti-Russia foreign policy. As for NATO and the West as a whole, it's also an important reference here. The interesting theme is the framing of Russophobia as a lobby seeking to pump up the NATO military budget, and Russophobia is also presented as a tool of individual career development for Western politicians. Another trope related to this is the anti-Russia sentiment as a political tool used by the US establishment in order to harm the good relationship between Russia and the US. And the normalization of this relationship is said to be a fundamental native interest for the US and for the solid West European states. Then, what is not so surprising, not a single non-Western country has been labeled as Russophobic. In the Russian official discourse, Russophobia is a characteristic of the Western world, and among others, we have several individual Western countries, including Germany, Canada, and I think this is hardly a secret to you, Norway. As for domestic actors, finally, not a single domestic actor has been treated by the Kremlin and the Mid as Russophobic, except for two occurrences in the Kremlin corpus that are due to Zyuganov and Zhirinovsky while they had a meeting with Putin. So, what can we say overall? For me, the most interesting finding is that we are witnessing a kind of circular logic here, is that Eastern European and Baltic countries have exported their historical Russophobia to the EU and NATO countries, including the US, while the Americans and the Europeans have encouraged, in their turn, Russophobia in Ukraine. And this is something that is captured by this grim nationalist cartoon that was elaborated and published by a Russian nationalist media called Regnum 1 year ago. So you can see this Ukrainians who are represented as neo-Nazis, so that were brainwashed by some external forces, and they are marching in the Western direction, of course. And this is something that is confirmed by the fact that the same tropes are used for different contexts. For instance, Russophobia would be elevated to the level of state policy in both the UK and Ukraine. Russophobia is often depicted as a political good that American, Western, and Eastern Europeans try to sell to their societies. So the politicians are selling Russophobia to the societies, and thus Russophobia is a minority-driven phenomenon, including in Ukraine, where what is promoted by so-called minority of national radicals associated to neo-Nazis. I will skip this this slide, and just a few words about the two other tropes. They are not frequently used. That's why we don't have quantifiable results for them, but they are still interesting cases, since both their meaning and the reference have changed in the Russian official discourse. Thus, de-Russification refers only to outside phenomena. This is the de-Russification of Ukraine and not of Russia anymore, because even in the 2000s there were like some uses of this term to describe the situation in Russia. So de-Russification is framed as this externally related term, as both the declining role of Russian in education and the public sphere, and as a forced assimilation of ethnic Russians outside of Russia. And as for national traitors trope, it still refers in Russian official rhetoric to domestic actors, but its meaning has been partly reversed. It is not a way of challenging the established political order now, but a tool to mobilize against domestic anti-regime forces. In other words, it's a part of what we can call a fifth column politics, since the people are who are targeted on the basis of their acting in cooperation with external rivals against the Russian state national interest. And the context of the undeclared war on Ukraine is crucial here. Once again, indeed, the term national traitors has been mobilized by Putin in two key moments, meaning in March 2014 during the annexation of Crimea, and last March too at the beginning of the so-called special operation in Ukraine. Here I come to my conclusion. I have discussed the concept of war nationalism that I framed as the use of nationalist rhetoric in wartime by the Putin regime. And its ultimate goal is to justify the Russian military aggression against Ukraine. These uses clearly show that the identity-related dimension of the war in Ukraine is crucial. Otherwise, the Russian regime would not have mobilized the nationalist rhetoric so intensively, as it turned it against its foreign adversaries and domestic critics. In doing so, the Russian regime has been selective and instrumental. And finally, and I will stop there, I would like to present just some other ways to study war nationalist dynamics in Russia. And there's other ways that can be addressed. One example of them would be the study of Russian naturalization policies. And here notably we could try to understand the way these policies are used in an attempt to divide the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian state. Another example would be the population displacement. For instance, what are the logic of the displacement of Ukrainians into Russia? And yet another option would be to study radical pro-war nationalist pressure on the state authorities that we can witness in now, and there's actors who keep calling to turn the special operation into a total war. I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and let's discuss all this stuff.
Thank you very much, Sergey, for this presentation. You kindly included me in the work, but I think it's fair to say that you and Tore have done the heavy lifting so far. But we have a lot of hands already, and we have about 45 minutes. I don't know even if I got all the hands, but let's start with Jakob, and wait for the microphone to introduce it. Julia, and then?
you, first of all, for a very interesting presentation. I have some methodological questions, though. One of the questions is that that when you study the use of various tropes, as you call them, it's important to look not only at the question of occurrences, but also at the frequency, meaning that you can end up with having a lot of occurrences in a certain period, but this could also be due to the fact that there is much more text being published in this period than in the previous period. So this question needs somehow to be addressed. And then another question that needs to be looked into is because you look at three political types of languages, the Kremlin, the MID, and State Duma. But I've been involved together with Julia in this project that is called Threat Diffuser, where we cooperate with Russian and Slavic linguists. And when they study the political language, they always compare the political language with the kind of Russian corpora in general, meaning that in order to measure the gap between the normal language and the political language, you need to somehow compare the political statements with the frequency and the occurrences in the political statements with the frequencies and occurrences in the general corpora. So I think that this needs to be somehow addressed, but because when you are going to publish the findings, you will most probably be met with this type of comments.
Would you like to respond?
Should we gather?
Well, we can collect a couple. So Julie is next.
Julie Wilhelmsen, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for presenting. I have done a lot of quite similar work also with these big corpuses of texts. So I have a question pertaining to that out of curiosity, I suppose, because my problem is that you get all these texts and it's hundreds and hundreds of pages. And you start reading and just as you, I want to capture the dynamics. So how does this change? How does the use of tropes and how important they are, how does it change over time? So this is a very concrete question. How do you manage? And how do you choose what to take away as an empirical finding? I myself work with discourse theory in the tradition of Laclau and Mouffe. What is your grasp, your methodological grasp? And then secondly, I suppose I just wanted to encourage you to be very, very clear on what your claims are epistemologically, because in my work, since I study Russian official texts, I've been accused of being a Russian propagandist, because what I'm doing is simply conveying what the Kremlin says or how Russia talks in a way. And of course, for me as a researcher, that is important, because how Russia talks says something about how it will act, probably to some extent. But I'm wondering, how do you relate to that? Or at least in your paper, you should be really clear that you are presenting official statements and how they evolve, not as the truth about what the world looks like, but as to show, in a way, how Russian nationalism functions in the mouth of official Russia. So that was just an encouragement, and I just take it for granted that you agree with me. So you're not explaining the real world, but you're, in a way, showing us how the Kremlin talks or the Duma talks or whatever. Thank you.
Let's stop there for now and let you have a chance to respond to those before you move on.
Thank you very much for these questions and comments. First of all, as for methodology, yes, of course, we have to look not only at occurrences, but also at the dynamic. And here is the question of the varying intensity of these occurrences, and that's the slide I had to skip, unfortunately. Indeed, I think we have a turning point. It is clearly 2014 for all the three corpora. and this is pretty much clear, and the intensity is increasing after this. So this is confirmed by some other knowledge we have about how the Putin regime functions and how this obsession with Ukraine has been constructed since the second Maidan revolution in Ukraine, not the first one. And this is corroborated by our findings. But what was puzzling with this wearing intensity issue is that there is a relative decline that is observed in all the three corpora around 2019 and the beginning of the year 2020. And the hypothesis that I have about it is that it is linked to the election of Volodymyr Zelensky as Ukrainian president, and we see it very well when we look at individual messages taken from this particular period. Is that Zelensky is first seen as an opposition figure who is not the same as the so-called hardliner Poroshenko, his predecessor, and so there is some hope in Moscow that Zelensky would change the things for the better in Ukraine, in Moscow's views, of course. Of course, we will be very attentive, cautious with this topic of intensity. But once again, we can use this like quantifiable logic only in the case of the Russophobia trope. There was another idea. Another idea was to include some other tropes. And this is linked to your second question about comparing the uses of some political of some terms in political rhetoric with the general corpora. We thought that we could include the terms like genocide or even nationalism in our analysis, and look at how the meanings are different when we look at the political uses and like the general uses. And here we could have some interesting results, but at this point, this is the question of timing. We don't have enough time, I think, to wrap up the article by the end of the year if we want to look at this. But it is a very interesting question, and I have just one example of how it could work out. In December 2021, there is a meeting with Putin. The meeting of his Presidential Council for the Human Rights, I think, in Russia, and there is a former Ukrainian journalist who became Russian propaganda, propaganda Russian journalist after the second Euromaidan, and who is who takes the floor and asks Putin, why don't you act in the face of the ongoing genocide in eastern Ukraine? That's December of 2021. And Putin responds, yeah, you are right, the things are very bad there in eastern Ukraine, but we have to think about the meaning of the term genocide, because we have like an official United Nations backed definition of the term, and so we have to be very cautious about inflating the inflation of the meaning of this term. And this is 2 months before the start of the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I think, but if we look at the like public uses of the terms like genocide and nationalism, we will have like a big, probably a big picture of meanings. But anyway, this could be very useful, and so very. I thank you very much for this comment. We will try to look at as much as possible for this paper, and probably for the work that we could do after this article. As for the question about the dynamics, first of all, thank you very much for this comment and encouragement about clarifying the things that we are not taking in the arguments of the Russian regime. We study how this rhetoric and the incorporation of different terms that were not typical of the official discourse, how all this instrumentalization of nationalist tropes have paved the way for the full-scale invasion, and how it contributed to the construction of an image of Ukraine as an identity threat to Russia. And I think it's very important to do so, because the two first logics that I've briefly discussed, the balance of power logic and the fear of democracy, democratization logic, they are predominant today in how that war, the war in Ukraine, is framed, and in the academic literature, in the public debate, and so on. But I think there is something more deep about this war, in terms precisely of identity and the construction of identity threats. So we will, of course, make the statement that we are not reproducing the Russian official propaganda. And then about another question about a deeper methodological, theoretical approach. We don't use a more general theory of discourse analysis. Our approach was much more empirically driven, if I can say. That we have tried to collect all the occurrences, and then we have coded all the messages we've got for the three corpora, using coding by the three of us to see if we agree on the meaning of that or of this or that term. Message, and then the same for identifying the referent. So, but I will think about the using maybe some mobilizing more general and theoretical approaches on discourse analysis for this work in progress. Thank you.
There were several hands, and I'm not sure if I got everyone, but we will take one question here. Yeah, and then you next.
Paul Kolstø, University of Oslo. Thank you for a very interesting talk based on very solid research, no doubt. You focus on rhetoric and the use of rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, and clearly your approach to nationalism is instrumentalist. And I'm an instrumentalist myself, so I fully support you there. But my question, I guess, would nevertheless be, even if Putin and his entourage are using nationalism instrumentally, can it also be an element of ideology, and that they believe in their own rhetoric? And if you compare the Russophobia in Ukraine and in, for instance, the Baltic states, as seen from the Kremlin, I think that when it comes to the Baltics, they would claim that not only, and perhaps believe that not only the political authorities, but also the public is Russian. While in Ukraine, they would say and perhaps maybe also believe that only the political leaders are anti-Russian, and they are not only anti-Russian but also anti-Ukrainian, and they would say that, Putin has said this 10 times, I believe, at least, that Russians and Ukrainians is one people. And I have come around to believe that he believes that himself. And the reason why I do so is that after in his major article published on the Kremlin website in July last year, when he repeated that, there was a poll taken in Ukraine which said that 41% of the Ukrainians also believe that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. So so he had reason to believe that he could come here as liberators. So my question is, can we then say that Putin is a captive of his own ideology and his own rhetoric?
We'll take one more in the back. Yep. If you give it to, yeah, okay.
Hi, my name is Oda Marchand and I'm still a student. I hope you will publish soon, because then I can use your findings as a theoretical framework. I was wondering about your method. It must have been a considerable amount of text, or I'm sorry if I couldn't, I just don't remember how many. And I was just wondering, how did you systematize the text? And I guess it would be, for example, 10,000 text one year and 20,000 text another year. How did you kind of control for the different amount of text? And yeah, I just think methods is very interesting. Thank you.
And then I'm sure I missed some hands the first round, because yeah, I've seen you, and Jakob I've seen once more. So, and just give me a sign, and then I'll include you in this. But now I'll take these two questions. Please, Sergey.
Thank you, Paul, for this very interesting question. Indeed, I think so. I would agree with you that there is like this process that first, I would say that since the very beginning, the Putin regime is obsessed with the idea of controlling what's going on within the country and within the political system. That hence we have this approach to creating a systemic opposition, and hence we have this strategy of controlling the nationalist agenda by borrowing from nationalist rhetoric, but also by cooperating with the various nationalist actors, sometimes by cooptation and sometimes by repression. So I think that's us, the two sides of the same coin. I mean, first it's this idea we have to control everything, including the nationalist agenda. And this is the process that has been accelerating since the early 2010s, especially toward the nationalists, because the Kremlin has created an ecosystem, I would say, of different actors that were pretty much loyal to the regime and who don't challenge the established political order. They don't say we would like to see some Caucasian republics splitting off, or they say rather we have to gather more lands, more forces behind the regime and for Russia. So these overtones are rather statist and patriotic than ethno-nationalist. But at the same time, And the case of Ukraine shows it very well. The concept of imperialism is not enough to explain this war, because there is something more, that the Ukrainians, or at least a part of the Ukrainian population, are considered as potential members of the same community, as potential Russians, and hence we have the thing I've mentioned at the end of my presentation, the uses of naturalization policies toward Ukrainians. And here again, the turning point is the same. It's 2014, the first policies that have been adopted this year in order to simplify the procedure of naturalization for people living in Donbass. And then during the ongoing invasion last July, these measures have been generalized, and now all Ukrainian citizens can take advantage of this naturalization. But however, of course, I agree with you that Putin probably ended up believing that Ukrainians, or at least a part of the Ukrainian society, would accept Russian domination, at least in certain regions of Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. But I see, however, still I see this instrumental, pragmatic approach, because this can be interpreted, framed as an attempt to divide the Ukrainian society. And so we take in all those who would accept Russian domination, Russian political domination and occupation, but those who would not accept, so we can let them be Ukrainians. So, you know, this logic are probably in play at the same time. And what happened since the start of the invasion, probably Putin is aware now that the whole Ukrainian society doesn't want to accept what Russia is doing, because he provoked probably against himself against his will a new mobilization of the patriotic sentiment in Ukraine. And what I was and that's what I was saying too, because for Ukraine since 2014, the war in Donbass acted as a nationalizing force at the not only at the government level but also at the society level. As for the methodological question, we have used an application, an R-based package called the Corpora Explorer, and there, thanks to Christian, we have uploaded this many documents for the free corpora, and then there is the possibility to search for selected terms we are interested in, and we can obtain some graphs thanks to that, with the varying intensity among the period we are interested in, and then we have, of course, you are right, we have to look at how many documents mobilize this term, because that could be that there are lots of occurrences, but inside the same, just one document per year or something like this. But this seems to be okay with that, according to the data we have, because I think the average share for each term used per document is 1.3 or 1.4. That means that a term is used in different documents. So it's seldom, it's rare that one term occurs more than 1 or 2 times in one document. So we have really this kind of reproduction of the same tropes we're interested in. But thank you very much for this.
Let me just add there that this is an application developed here at NUPI by a colleague of ours, Christian Lundby, and it makes it possible to search through, for instance, all the documents that are published on kremlin.ru fairly quickly and easily, and you will get a heat map that will show when a word is mentioned and how often it's mentioned in an individual text. So it's a very useful tool, and it's publicly available. He's about to wrap up his PhD now, so you should not contact him now, but after Christmas, if you are starting your MA work then you should definitely contact him. Christian Lundby. Corpora Explorer. Okay, then it's you.
Thank you. My name is Arne Schneider, retired. I had a role in NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council, when they were working in former Yugoslavia. And I'm in particular interested in the Russian Orthodox Church's role in this conflict. Because in the beginning, it was quite evident that Putin used Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church in his rhetorics. And during your presentation, you talked about Ukraine's emancipation from Russia and mentioned the creation of a unified Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And my question is, did this come before the armed conflict, the creation of a unified Ukrainian church? Or was this the result of Russia's use of Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church? Because I saw this during the Balkan conflict, and I'm curious about, is this conscious use of the church, and what would be the consequences if Ukraine had not split from the Russian Orthodox Church? How would the Ukrainian public react if they were still linked to Russia? Thank you.
And then we have a question there. Yeah.
Alexandra Brankova, Uppsala University. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My question is also kind of building on the orthodox element here. When it comes to coding the tropes, have you considered sort of civilizational trope? The political use of orthodoxy, messianism, sort of more cultural elements when you code for identity tropes? And I'm asking this because I'm also researching more radical groups like Tsarigrad or Iborsky Club. And I'm just wondering, have you explored these tropes within your corpora of texts? And I have a second question in terms of the actors represented as Russophobic. What is the role of Balkan countries? Because you mentioned Poland and the Baltic states, but what about Bulgaria or Romania, who are also EU countries, or non-EU Balkan countries? Have you seen anything about that in your data? Thank you.
Would you also like to come in on this, Paul, since this is your topic? Yeah, let Sergei answer first, but yeah. So.
Thank you very much for this two interesting questions. First of all, about the Russian Orthodox Church role in this conflict. You know, in this, in our empirical analysis, there was just one or maybe two messages regarding the Orthodox dimension, and the message was that the creation of a united Orthodox Church of Ukraine was something that was Russophobic in its nature, because that was a split from the same like Orthodox Christian space, which is considered by the Moscow Patriarchate as its canonical territory. So still Patriarch Kirill, he considers himself as being like the major religious leader in this space. That's why Ukraine is so important for the Russian Church. There is another aspect is that there are many churches that have been since Ukraine's independence affiliated to the Moscow Patriarchate, even if the religious context in Ukraine was very complex. There were many three main competing Orthodox churches that were not recognized by some supreme religious Orthodox authorities, and it's quite recently in the context of the undeclared Russia's war on Ukraine in 2018 that this united Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been created. And clearly this was a political project. This was, of course, a religious project for many Ukrainian religious leaders, but this also was a political project guided by then President Poroshenko. For him, it was very important to show this process of separation, emancipation of Ukraine from Russia in the context of the Donbass conflict. And so since then, of course, it was much more competition for the Russian Church in Ukraine, and then there were more and more people, in Ukraine, Orthodox Christians who were migrating from the Russian Church into the United Church of Ukraine, because this church was recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is considered as like the supreme authority in Orthodox Christian world, and so these processes, they began. I mean, they come back to several years before the start of the full-scale invasion. And I would like to add that for the Russian Church, of course, if we look at the discourse of Patriarch Kirill, he sided, of course, with the Kremlin, and he tried to frame this war as a civilizational war. He used the terms which are in line with the official conservative discourse, which is based on the rejection of LGBT rights, because he said this is a civilizational conflict because they want some forces, meaning the West, want to impose this new morality on Ukraine, and the litmus test would be the pride parades in Ukraine. And so we here, he say, in Russia, but also in the Donbass, the people don't want to accept this. But even so, I think the Russian Church is quite unhappy with this conflict because of the influence of the Church, which is now declining considerably in Ukraine. We don't still have some solid sociological data to analyze these processes, but it's clear that only a tiny minority of Orthodox Ukrainian would identify, at least publicly today, with the Moscow Patriarchate, which is in Ukraine framed as an ally of the Putin regime. So I think there is not much space for the Russian church in Ukraine in the upcoming years, and its role will probably decline, and we saw this with some religious leaders who are affiliated to the Moscow Patriarchate, who sided back and stopped to use the name of Kirill during the masses since the beginning of the invasion. And this is still, the situation is still there. So if the war continues, so I think the chances that the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine remains high are declining every month, and probably it's too late for the Moscow Patriarchate to think about Ukraine in the following years.
Sergei, before you turn to the final question, I see time is flying. Let me first check if there are any online questions. No. Or was that a yes? No. Okay, and then I had one more question from the audience. This is the very final chance because we have 5 minutes left. So, question from Jakob. Then we add your question to that.
Okay.
So we take everything together. Any other takers? Then you have to sign up now.
My question is also of a kind of more methodological character. When you study language, and language is about also communication, it's important to study the language in the kind of proper context. And I think that what is also important when you examine those statements is to have in mind that there's a hierarchy of those who make statements, meaning that a statement made by a Russian president in a system that is quite often described as a personificated regime, personalistic regime, is definitely more important than a statement made by the kind of non-known bureaucrat from MIT or a kind of very marginal deputy in the State Duma. So I think that this issue of hierarchy of statements is also important. And then there is also one body of text that I think is missing from your examination. And since we are talking about war, and war is about security, then maybe you should consider including the corpora of text that are available at the website of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, the corpora of text that is made up of the official doctrinal documents on various questions, national security, economic security, and so on, to see to what extent those tropes that you try to trace back in the text you have already examined are there. And then also some ideas about what other tropes. Over the past months, there is a lot of focus in the Russian debate on the Ukraine as an anti-Russia project. So this issue of Ukraine as it's not only about anti-Russian measures, but Ukraine as a kind of anti-Russia is one trope. Another trope that needs also to be maybe examined is this whole issue of the Anglo-Saxon conspiracy against Russia that is also popping out in the statements. And then the issue of Gosizmena as a part of the debate, because we have seen, for instance, a huge number of cases being put under this umbrella of Gosizmena.
Very good, thank you. Then you have 3 minutes to answer some small questions about civilization, culture, and different tropes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for all these questions about the civilizational tropes. We didn't see, at least for these 3 selected tropes, we didn't see like clearly identified civilizational dimension in this discourse. Probably it should exist, but we have to look at other terms to catch this. But I think here the Putin regime is much more relying on parastate actors, including the Russian Orthodox Church, to do so, because the Putin regime, it's not the sole actor within Russia, and this is all these parastate actors are a part of the systems. They have their roles. They act on their own behalf. They have a certain autonomy, but they should like act within the limits that are imposed by the Putin administrations. That the general logic, I would say, which is based on this strategy of control, this obsession with control. As for Balkan and countries, Bulgaria, Romania, no mentions of these countries. I think they are considered as minor actors that don't have any influence, any impact on the relationship between Russia and the Western world, or even with Ukraine, which is even Ukraine is often seen as a proxy, as I said. So Balkan countries does not exist in this picture, and the whole picture is about the relationship between Russia and the West more generally. So the Ukraine is represented mostly as something that is disputed between these two parts, Russia and the West, and the so-called solid. There is this interesting term that we see in our corporate, the solid Western countries, the big Western European countries and the United States, who have some impact on the world politics. And at the same time, the Putin regime says that the Western hegemony is now in decline. But this is contradictory, because at the same time you say that we are disputing something with this hegemon is decline, in an attempt, I think, to put an end to this hegemony, the so-called hegemony. There was a question about the context. Yes, what you say, President Putin, what President Putin says is more important than what say some bureaucrats. Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, of course, because the words of Putin are then replicated by other actors, by bureaucratic hierarchies and so on. But this replication is meaningful in itself. I mean, these terms become something that is authorized, that become a trope. Exactly, something that we can use today to in official rhetoric, and something that was not authorized yesterday, several years ago. So this replication, the use of this word by many actors is also important. And what about the inclusion of the documents of Security Council of Russia into our corpus? It's pretty much the issue of time. We would like to, but it would take more time to work on this.
And space, I guess.
And space, yeah. But yeah, you are right. And of course, Ukraine is anti-Russia. It's a part of the general Russophobia trope. And the same for the plot. We have this term and this framing in our corpora too.
Okay, I think we have to end there. Before we wrap up, though, I'd like to just make a short announcement that within the same project where we collaborate with emerging Russian scholars, we'll also have a second seminar now before the end of the year on 6th of December with Ilya Yablakov and our own Natalia Moon-Larsen about conspiracy theories in Russia and the COVID pandemic. So you're very welcome back here on the 6th of December. But as for now, I hope you would all like to join me in giving a big hand to Sergei for his presentation.
Thank you.